Billionaires Row is a failure. Almost half of luxury units across 7 buildings in this super exclusive Midtown Manhattan stretch, where apartments have sold for more than $100 million, sit empty and dark. Meanwhile, finding a reasonable living space in the city as a non-billionaire can be virtually impossible. Billionaires Row was unofficially named in the months leading up to the 2014 completion of 157, a mixed-use, super-tall building at 157 West 57th Street. Although the neighborhood already had other pricey properties like Deutsche Bank Center, formerly Time Warner Center, it didn't become Billionaires Row until the arrival of ultra-luxury super-talls like 157, 432 Park Avenue, 53 West 53rd, and 220 Central Park South. Skyscrapers have slowly been getting taller and thinner for years, but Billionaires Row has given rise to a new form of skyscraper entirely, the super-slender residential tower. In Manhattan, space comes at a cost, which means if you want to build big, you have to build up. To develop the tiny sites they'd secured with buildings tall enough to offer Central Park views, developers on Billionaires Row spent years acquiring the air rights for the properties around their lots. That meant that they could combine those new air rights to build their property taller and ensure those nearby buildings won't block their newly built views of Central Park. It's sort of like piecing together a very expensive puzzle. New York's building code considers a building slim if it has a width-to-height ratio of 1:7, but the towers on Billionaires Row go far beyond that. 157 was the first of the bunch to complete in 2014 with a ratio of 1:8. Then came 432 Park Avenue with a ratio of 1:15. From there, 53 West 53rd, 111 West 57th Street, and the Central Park Tower at 217 West 57th Street, which was the last of the buildings to begin sales, unsurprisingly has the most vacancies, with a whopping 89% of its 179 units sitting empty. 157 made headlines in 2017 for being home to New York's largest apartment foreclosure. The original owner was Nigerian oil tycoon Kolawole Akani Aluko, who was implicated in a money laundering scheme that included the unit for which he had paid $50.9 million. It was eventually unloaded by its mortgage holder at an auction for $36 million. Today, the thinnest of the bunch is 111 West 57th Street. The 85-story building is officially the world's thinnest skyscraper. It's just 18 meters wide, but rises to 435 meters in height. That's a width-to-height ratio of 1:24. And of course, when you're 400 meters in the air, you have to think about the wind. Engineers have a few tricks they can use to keep the building from swaying too much, like constructing setbacks on the building's facade, leaving the glass out of mechanical floors, and installing a tuned mass damper at the top of the building. Now, there's a logic to the super slender tower. The taller you build, the more value you can squeeze out of that small plot of land you were able to find on Manhattan Island. To make the construction of a super slim tower worth it, you have to make those units really, really expensive. That's where luxury real estate brokers like Ryan Serhant, founder and CEO of Serhant, come in. According to him, Billionaires Row is a pretty global demographic and a global city, so there's a lot of pied-à-terres, so part-time owners. There's a lot of investor owners. Billionaires Row has basically shaped a completely new asset class of luxury real estate. That's partially because there's simply a lot more currency to go around. The amount of money being devoted around the world has grown enormously, creating what some academics call a massive pool of dough. But alongside this blast of global wealth, wealth inequality has also grown. A smaller share of people control a larger share of the world's wealth, and that means that people at the top have bigger and bigger bank accounts. One place to put some of that money? The Billionaires Row. All assets occur on a liquidity spectrum. On one end, you have cash, the most liquid asset of all. The other is real estate. Think a building with a pitched roof and a backyard. Elsewhere along the spectrum, you have things like paintings and stocks and bonds. With fewer units in the building, you can start to control more of the variables that typically make a house a non-liquid asset. The elevator opens directly to the apartment. There's no backyard that you have to maintain, no street-level windows to protect from vandals on the ground, no leaky roof you need to repair. Even with the money and engineering to make buildings like this possible, super slim skyscrapers can't just pop up anywhere. Developers need permission to get the projects off the ground, and there are restrictions on how tall developers are allowed to build. But in New York, there are a lot of different loopholes developers can jump through to go beyond the limits. That's where something called incentive zoning comes into play. Zoning is a set of procedures that establishes the shape of the city. Things like how tall a building can be and how much space must stay between structures is all covered in the city's zoning policy. Incentive zoning is when the contractor can break those rules to a degree as long as they do something in exchange that's to the community's benefit. Instances include building a public park or upgrading a subway line. Just to the west of Billionaires Row, New York City used zoning incentives with the Hudson Yards development to upgrade the subway, create new public parks, and expand the nearby Javits Center. 432 Park Avenue was able to rise so high in part because of another loophole in the city's zoning laws. Any floors used for mechanical or structural equipment don't count towards the total height of the building. And at 432 Park, roughly a quarter of its floors are reserved for equipment, not apartments. There are legitimate reasons to have so much space reserved for mechanics. For one, the open-air mechanical floors allow wind to flow through the building in order to reduce any sway. And of course, you need space to store the heating, air conditioning, and elevator motors. But there's an ongoing debate about whether developers are exploiting the rule in order to build further into the sky. Is this great architecture or capitalist ambition? Can those things be the same thing? Is that the very essence of New York? For all the effort, money, and planning that's gone into these buildings, it's striking just how many of the units seem empty. It turns out there's a couple different reasons for it. They're either unsold or simply unoccupied. There are quite a few Billionaires Row properties still on the market. Nearly half of the units in 7 of the buildings were unsold in August 2021. That's $6.7 billion worth of condos still on the market without a buyer. That might be because what was initially unique about 157, the Central Park views, floor-to-ceiling windows, and units sprawling an entire floor, was quickly replicated by the other super-tall residential towers that popped up. Now, if you're in the market for an ultra-luxury apartment in Manhattan, you have a lot more options. For years, the luxury real estate market in New York City had more supply than demand, but that's starting to change. By September 2021, Manhattan hit record-high sales of luxury properties. But sales have been depressed recently by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has kept foreign buyers, who typically gobble up midtown units for their proximity to theaters and hotels, overseas. Perhaps the more interesting case is the units that are sold, but nobody lives there all the time. They're second, third, or fourth homes, or simply just a way to store their wealth. Every few years, the City of New York does a big housing and vacancy survey. In 2017, they found there were 75,000 pied-à-terre properties across the city, up from 55,000 in 2014. The 2 zip codes where most Billionaires Row properties are located, roughly half of the single-family homes and condos aren't occupied by their owners. In the rest of the city, the owner occupancy rate is closer to 75%. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean all of these units are sitting empty. They could be rented out by their owners who live elsewhere. But none of the Billionaires Row developers would share their occupancy rates with us, and this data gives us a glimpse into how the area around Billionaires Row compares with the rest of New York. Of course, there's more to owning a property on Billionaires Row than just having a spot to stay on your trips to New York. You can also score a pretty hefty tax break. In New York, condos are taxed as if they're a rental apartment building. But the problem is nobody's really renting a $100 million apartment, so there's no benchmark for what that rental value would be. $10,000 a month or $100,000 a month. There's no precedent for something like that. So what ends up happening is the Billionaires Row condo is taxed the same as a unit that's worth a fraction of the cost. But that's not all. Ultra-luxury can also add on another massive tax break through the 421A exemption. The 421A tax break was originally introduced in New York in the 1970s as a way to encourage developers to build residential housing, as the city was concerned about people leaving for the suburbs. The rules have changed a lot over the years. Today, it's been rebranded as the Affordable Housing New York program. Essentially, developers can get up to 100% of their property taxes erased for a set number of years if a fifth of their development is classified as affordable housing. Despite none of the units in 157 being anywhere near affordable to a non-billionaire, it still benefits from this tax break. It's an added draw for buyers considering purchasing a luxury condo. The New York City Independent Budget Office actually did a deep dive into 157's use of the 421A exemption. In order to qualify for it, the developers built 66 units of affordable housing in the Bronx, miles away from Billionaires Row. The IBO estimated that exemption will cost the city an estimated $65.6 million in property tax revenue over 10 years. Still, it found that the way the state of New York values its condos provided an even greater tax break to 157's owners than the affordable housing exemption. These tax discrepancies don't just happen on Billionaires Row. Bloomberg found that one $2.1 million condo in Brooklyn came with a tax bill of just $157. Meanwhile, a condo in the Bronx worth roughly $235,000 paid nearly $4,000. The city is synonymous with the skyscraper. It's been shaped by those buildings. Each rose as a product of the events in the city at that time, and now they shape the city's future. New York had it with the Empire State and the Chrysler Building rising at the very end of the boom years. And again with the World Trade Center in the 1970s that stood through the 80s, 90s, right up to 2001. And again when the city was rebuilding post 9/11, when it was trying to work out what it wanted to stand at that now incredible site down at Ground Zero. The success of developments that make up Billionaires Row varies greatly by development. 220 Central Park South is one of the most lucrative projects to date and is home to the most expensive sale in the United States. Similarly, 432 Park Avenue has been the best performing development and currently houses the most expensive publicly listed home for sale in the United States. Conversely, the original Billionaires Row Tower, 157, has struggled to retain its value as a new crop of developments began dotting the southern edge of Central Park. Over the next decade, the full picture of how well these properties retain their value will be more understood. So, the next time you're wandering around Central Park, wondering what it's like to live in the lap of luxury, now you know. There might not be anyone in the building, or people could be coming in and out all the time. Whether it's a pied-à-terre or a hedge funder's family home, one thing's for certain: Billionaires Row isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video and also share with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for more lifestyle videos and make sure to turn on the notifications for future updates about your favorite personalities.